The Gauntlet Runner, Edwin Eastman's survival among Comanche tribe runner. Die as we rejoin Edwin Eastman's journey. These 3 words define his impossible choice. In our previous episode, we witnessed his capture by a powerful Native American tribe, now forced to run a deadly gauntlet. Edwin makes a split-second decision that no prisoner before him has dared attempt. To ensure you never miss an episode, subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories, and join us for each installment of this extraordinary, true account. How will Edwin's desperate gambit affect his standing in the tribe, and what ancient ritual awaits him in the continuing narrative of his captivity? Preparations for the death run. The morning arrived with a grim finality. Edwin Eastman and his fellow prisoners were roughly escorted from their confinement and brought to an open area where they could observe the bustling activity around them. Though their hands and feet remained bound, they were positioned upright on the grassy ground, allowing them a clear view of the ominous preparations underway. I knew our time for action had come. Edwin later recounted, the old trapper had warned us about this ritual, and now we were witnessing the preparations with a painfully personal interest. The Native Americans, whom Edwin identified as IANS, were preparing themselves for what was to come. They removed their decorative garments, necklaces, and other ornaments that might restrict their movement. Their actions were deliberate and practiced, suggesting this was a well-established ritual rather than an impromptu execution. What struck me most, Edwin noted, was watching them enter the woods and return with freshly cut clubs. Each warrior tested the weight and balance of their weapon with disturbing familiarity. We needed no interpreter to understand what these implements meant for our immediate future. Several hundred warriors gathered on the plain, organizing themselves with military precision. The prisoners watched in silent dread as the tribal members arranged themselves into 2 parallel lines, stretching approximately 300 yards across the open ground. Each warrior stood armed with a club, facing the opposite line, with a gap of 3 to 4 paces between the rows. A tribal elder approached the prisoners and explained the rules of what Edwin later described as their savage sport. The captives would be forced to run between these 2 lines, while warriors on both sides would attempt to strike them with clubs as they passed. The elder offered a false promise. Any prisoner who managed to run the entire gauntlet and reach the foot of the nearby cliff without being caught would be spared. I asked the old trapper if he believed this promise. Edwin recalled his response was immediate and certain. Not by a darn sight, he spat. It's all a cussed July show, just to make us do our put-east. They'll roast us all the same. Last time I was satisfied that the promise was worthless. Even if by some miracle one could survive the gauntlet, no man could outrun their fastest warriors to the cliff. The moment of truth arrived. Several warriors approached the prisoner and selected a Mexican captive to run first. They untied his bonds and pushed him toward the beginning of the gauntlet. He was a strong man with an athletic build that suggested speed and endurance. He stood there momentarily. Edwin observed, calculating his odds. Measuring the distance with his eyes, he took a deep breath and launched himself forward with remarkable speed. Despite his physical prowess, the Mexican prisoner managed only 10 steps before multiple club strikes rendered him unconscious. His body crumpled to the ground as warriors dragged him aside. His brief run, demonstrating the futility of the challenge. 3 more prisoners followed in succession. Each met the same fate, though one managed to advance slightly farther before collapsing under the relentless blows. None made it even a quarter of the way through the gauntlet. As Edwin watched his companions fall, he realized that conventional approaches had proven fatal. If he was to have any chance at survival, he would need to attempt something no prisoner before him had dared. A bold plan and an unexpected escape. It was now Edwin Eastman's turn to face the gauntlet. The warriors approached him, cutting his bonds and pushing him forward to the starting position. As he stood at the entrance of the deadly corridor, a desperate plan crystallized in his mind. In those few critical moments before the signal, Edwin later wrote, I conceived a strategy so audacious that even I questioned my sanity. Yet facing certain death, even the slimmest chance seemed worth taking. Edwin had keenly observed his surroundings while watching his fellow prisoners fall. He noticed that, apart from the warriors forming the gauntlet, the rest of the tribal members were positioned behind him. Crucially, the area to his sides remained relatively clear. My plan was deceptively simple. Edwin explained I would begin running, as if intending to enter the gauntlet, but then abruptly veer right or left and sprint directly down the valley, toward the dense forest at its edge. If I could reach those woods and disappear into their tangled depths, I might survive long enough to find an escape route from this natural prison. Even as he formulated this plan, Edwin recognized its numerous flaws. The Native Americans knew every trail and hidden path in the valley. Several warriors would likely outpace him, despite his confidence in his own speed. If caught, he would face punishment, far worse than what awaited him in the gauntlet. Unknown to Edwin at that moment, the valley had only two entrances, both vigilantly guarded. Looking back now, he reflected, I'm astonished by my own boldness, but as the old saying goes, drowning men will grasp at straws, and in that moment, my hastily conceived plan seemed promising. The signal came. Edwin launched forward at full speed, initially running directly toward the gauntlet. As expected, the warriors raised their clubs in anticipation, each eager to land the first blow. When he was just a few yards from entering the deadly corridor, Edwin suddenly pivoted sharply to the right. Summoning every ounce of strength, he burst through a cluster of elderly spectators and onlookers who were watching the proceedings. Despite their surprised attempts to grab him, Edwin broke free in seconds and sprinted down the valley, with the entire tribe in pursuit, their angry shouts echoing behind him. About half a dozen warriors, faster than their companions, pulled ahead of the main group. For a brief, hopeful moment, Edwin maintained his lead, but soon reality set in. His initial burst of adrenaline began to fade. To my alarm, Edwin recounted, I found myself growing weaker with each stride. My legs felt increasingly heavy, my breathing labored and painful. The forest edge seemed tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. Glancing over his shoulder, Edwin saw one pursuer had closed the gap to within 200 yards and was gaining rapidly. The tree line was now visible ahead, and Edwin pushed himself beyond his limits to reach its protective shadows. With the forest just 50 yards away and his closest pursuer only slightly farther behind, disaster struck. Edwin's foot caught on an unseen obstacle, sending him tumbling to the ground. He scrambled to his feet just as the warrior reached him. Fortunately for me, Edwin noted, he had discarded his club during the chase to increase his speed as he lunged toward me. I met him with the most powerful punch I could muster, striking him directly under the chin. The blow connected perfectly. The warrior fell backward, momentarily stunned, and sprawled on the grass. Edwin turned immediately toward the forest, ready to plunge into its protective undergrowth. As he took his first step toward freedom, the dense foliage parted directly in front of him. Edwin found himself face to face with an enormous Native American warrior of unusual appearance. The shock of this unexpected encounter paralyzed Edwin briefly for a critical moment. I stood frozen, Edwin recalled. Not so my new opponent. Assessing the situation instantly, he lunged forward and pinned me to the ground with seemingly effortless strength. Edwin quickly recovered from his shock and struggled frantically against the giant's grip. But his efforts proved futile. By now other warriors had arrived at the scene, including the first pursuer, who had regained consciousness. Enraged by his humiliation, this warrior drew a knife and moved to kill Edwin on the spot. In a surprising turn of events, the giant warrior intervened, blocking the attack and severely reprimanding the would-be killer in their native tongue. Though Edwin couldn't understand the words, the authority in the giant's voice was unmistakable. Under the giant's orders, Edwin was bound again and placed under the guard of two warriors. They marched him back through the valley, past the disbanded gauntlet, and returned him to confinement. My desperate gambit had failed, Edwin concluded, yet something about my attempt seemed to have caught the attention of the imposing warrior who had captured me. I couldn't know then how significant this encounter would prove to be. Preparations for the fire execution. Edwin Eastman found himself once again confined in solitary imprisonment. The crushing disappointment of his failed escape attempt weighed heavily on his mind. So close to freedom, yet now back in captivity. With prospects even bleaker than before, I was reinstalled in my gloomy prison, Edwin later wrote. And after my guards tied me in the usual manner, they left me alone with my thoughts. which were anything but pleasant. When my mind turned to the uncertain fate of my wife, I experienced such mental anguish as I pray no person should ever know. As night gave way to morning, Edwin recalled the ominous warning from the old trapper. A deep conviction settled over him that this would be his final day alive. The tribal members provided him with the customary meager meal, and approximately an hour later, guards removed him from confinement and brought him outside. Edwin was reunited with his fellow prisoners on the open plain. The captives were securely fastened to stakes, but positioned upright, allowing them a clear view of the disturbing preparations taking place before them. It became immediately apparent that our captors wanted us to witness every detail of what was to come. Edwin observed on the level ground facing their temple. Scores of muscular warriors worked diligently, driving massive wooden posts into the earth in a semicircular arrangement. The prisoners watched as numerous tribal members ventured into the nearby woods with tomahawks in hand. The sound of chopping echoed across the valley, and soon they returned carrying bundles of firewood. With practiced efficiency, they attached strange copper chains to each post. Warriors began applying paint to their faces and bodies in vivid red and black stripes, creating fearsome patterns that signaled ritual significance. We needed no explanation to understand what these preparations meant. Edwin noted grimly. This was clearly the prelude to death by fire. The prisoners remained largely silent, but Edwin observed the stern, resigned expressions on their faces. Each man fully comprehended the terrible fate awaiting them. Their appearance was ghastly, travel-stained, covered in dust and dried blood, with some displaying fresh wounds from the previous day's sport. Their clothing hung in tatters, making them objects of pity that would have stirred compassion in any heart not hardened by hatred. My brain felt as if it were on fire, Edwin recalled. Had I been able to free myself from my bonds, I would gladly have sought immediate death at the hands of the nearest warrior, rather than endure the prolonged torture that awaited me. Eventually, the preparations concluded and the audience assembled. Comanche and Apache tribal members gathered before the temple, forming a vast semicircle. The older men occupied the terraces of the temple, while strangely attired priests of Powwow sat at its summit. Directly in front of the temple stood a makeshift throne where an elderly chief sat surrounded by his subordinates. An aging warrior with a particularly repulsive appearance seemed to direct the proceedings, assisted by approximately 100 younger warriors. These men approached the prisoners, released them from their initial restraints, stripped away their ragged garments, and bound them individually to the prepared stakes. To the hour of my death, I could never forget that scene, Edwin later wrote. For years it haunted me. Even now I sometimes wake screaming in terror, imagining I see again that mob of painted warriors, the crowded temple terraces adorned with bright tribal colors, the small group of doomed captives, the firewood stakes, and all the terrible instruments of death. Behind this horrific tableau rose the white cliffs, fringed with the dark green foliage of pine trees. Sunlight fell across the entire scene, creating a jarring contrast between natural beauty and human cruelty. At a signal from their leader, the executioners piled firewood around each prisoner. They carefully positioned the bundles at a sufficient distance to ensure a slow death, allowing the spectators ample time to witness the victim's suffering. The fires were lit, and thick smoke initially billowed around the captives, threatening to suffocate them before the flames could do their work. Within seconds, however, the wood caught fully and the smoke began to clear as the heat intensified and the prisoners started to writhe in agony. A deafening cheer erupted from more than 3,000 tribal members watching the spectacle. The heat grew increasingly unbearable. Edwin's skin blistered and burned. Dizzy and faint, he sensed death approaching and longed for it as an escape from the excruciating pain. Some prisoners, driven frantic by their suffering, screamed in anguish. Others endured in silence. Edwin summoned all his fortitude, determined not to cry out. I had closed my eyes and was fervently praying for the relief that I knew death must soon provide, Edwin recounted, when I was startled by a wild cry, followed by a collective gasp of astonishment from the spectators. Opening his eyes, Edwin saw the giant warrior who had captured him the previous day rapidly approaching through the crowd. The tribal members parted before him, their expressions revealing a mixture of fear and respect. The imposing figure charged directly toward Edwin, kicking away the burning bundles of wood, quickly cutting Edwin's bonds and dragging him toward the temple. Amid the confused shouting of the crowd, the giant warrior raised his hand commandingly for silence. He spoke several words in the Comanche language, of which Edwin understood only one Coetzetl, which he later learned was the name of one of their deities. Overwhelmed by pain, exhaustion, and the sudden shock of unexpected salvation, Edwin lost consciousness as the warrior continued to address the crowd. Salvation and tribal initiation. When Edwin Eastman regained consciousness, he found himself lying on the grass with a giant warrior kneeling beside him. The Native American held in his palm some crushed bark with a distinctly pungent and aromatic scent, which he was holding near Edwin's nostrils as a restorative. As my senses returned, Edwin later recorded, I became aware of a cluster of warriors surrounding us. Their threatening expressions and agitated gestures made it clear they were displeased with this unexpected intervention. One warrior, perhaps emboldened by the apparent indifference of the giant, stepped forward with menacing intent. He unsheathed his knife and raised the long, glittering blade above his head, poised to plunge it into Edwin's defenseless body. In an instant, the giant warrior, whom Edwin would later know as Walmetkla, sprang to his feet. His imposing figure seemed to grow even larger as rage transformed his features. With lightning speed, he seized the would-be assassin by the throat and hurled him backward with tremendous force. The man went careening through the crowd before crashing to the ground several yards away. Turning to the remaining onlookers, Walmetkla delivered a sharp rebuke in his native tongue. Though Edwin couldn't understand the words, the authority in his voice was unmistakable. He gestured for the crowd to disperse, which they did without hesitation, leaving Edwin alone with his unexpected protector. From the nearby temple, Edwin could clearly hear the crackling of flames and the agonized wails of his fellow prisoners as the fire consumed their bodies. Their cries of pain mingled with the triumphant shouts of the spectators, including women who filled the terraces of the lodges and temple. The women's brightly colored robes created a stark contrast against their dark complexions, adding to the surreal quality of the scene. The sun had reached its zenith. Edwin observed shining with unclouded brilliance over the scene of brutality. The mountainous walls of milky quartz that enclosed the valley caught the sunlight, reflecting it in countless prismatic hues that gave the impression of being in some enchanted realm. A beautiful setting for such unspeakable cruelty. Walmetkla soon returned, accompanied by a young woman carrying an assortment of roots and strips of long bark. Kneeling beside Edwin, she began methodically applying these natural remedies to his burned limbs. First came a layer of leaves, followed by strips of bark wrapped tightly around his injuries. Within minutes, Edwin was completely swaddled in these bandages, resembling an ancient mummy. Once the treatment was complete, Walmetkla and the young woman carefully lifted Edwin and carried him inside the temple. They descended a wooden ladder into a darkened chamber with walls covered in animal hides and curious, symbolic designs moving through this outer room. They brought Edwin to an inner apartment, separated by a thick curtain made of buffalo robes. In the corner stood a simple couch, where they gently placed him. After giving the girl some brief instructions, Walmetkla departed. The young woman soon returned with an earthen vessel filled with a dark liquid, which she indicated through gestures that Edwin should drink. To my amazement, Edwin noted the leaves binding my burned limbs had already produced a remarkable effect. I no longer felt any pain from my injuries. After taking a deep draught of the mysterious liquid, I quickly fell into a profound sleep. When Edwin awoke, it was already dark. The only illumination came from a small blue flame burning on a tripod in the center of the room. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he began to examine his surroundings more carefully. The chamber contained numerous strange objects, oddly shaped animal skins, horns from various beasts, and grotesque figurines carved from reddish clay. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of burning coal, making breathing uncomfortable. In his weakened state, Edwin's mind began to play tricks on him. He imagined seeing shadowy movements at the edges of his vision and thought he heard the distinctive rattle of a snake. Panic seized him in his desperate attempt to move. Away from the perceived threat, Edwin thrashed against his bandages and accidentally knocked over a section of the wall covering made from animal pelts. To his horror, this revealed a large nest of rattlesnakes. Behind the hides, my terror was complete. Edwin recalled. I screamed uncontrollably as the serpents, disturbed from their rest, began to writhe and rattle. His cries brought several Native Americans rushing into the chamber, carrying torches that illuminated the scene. They quickly drove the snakes away and transferred Edwin to a more comfortable location, where he eventually fell back into an exhausted sleep. The following morning, Edwin was brought into the presence of Walmekla and several tribal leaders for a ceremony of profound significance. From the solemn atmosphere and formal arrangements, Edwin understood that something momentous was about to occur, though he remained ignorant of the specific details. The setting was a council chamber within the temple. Walmekla sat upon an elevated throne, surrounded by numerous chiefs adorned in their finest war paint. Feathered headdresses and ceremonial robes, dawn light filtered through the entrance, casting long shadows across the stone floor. I was about to undergo the ceremony of adoption into the tribe, Edwin explained. Had I understood their language, it might have been fascinating, but as it was, I merely followed directions like a puppet, completely dependent on physical cues. A profound silence filled the chamber as a senior chief approached Edwin. The man muttered something in which Edwin could only distinguish the words Americano and Quidacatl before leading him to the foot of the dais where Walmekla was seated. Walmekla rose from his throne and delivered a lengthy address directed at Edwin. Though the words were incomprehensible to him, the solemnity of the moment was unmistakable. Following this speech, the warriors formed a circle around Edwin and began moving in a synchronized pattern. While performing a haunting chant, a young boy and girl stood to one side, providing rhythmic accompaniment on a traditional drum that produced a monotonous but hypnotic beat. Edwin stood motionless at the center of this activity, aware that he was participating in a ritual that would fundamentally change his status among these people. When this portion of the ceremony concluded, Edwin was LED outside. His remaining clothes were removed and replaced with only leather leggings and moccasins. Tribal members then applied paint and oil to his exposed skin in specific patterns, using sharp knives normally reserved for scalping. They shaved his hair, leaving only a narrow ridge running from his forehead to the nape of his neck. Thus disguised and symbolically reborn, Edwin wrote, I was again brought before the chief, who embraced me as one would welcome a new family member. At Walmekla's signal, a young warrior stepped forward bearing gifts, a necklace, shield, bow with a quiver of arrows, tomahawk, and lance. These were ceremoniously presented to Edwin, along with a tobacco pouch filled with kinnick, the tribal substitute for tobacco. Equipped with these symbols of tribal membership, Edwin was placed at the center of another circle, this time outside the lodge. The warriors removed a small piece of turf from the ground, a symbolic gesture whose meaning Edwin did not understand, and began what he described as incantations. The dance that followed was unlike anything Edwin had ever witnessed. It consisted of rhythmic movements, punctuated by piercing yells, vigorous jumps, and guttural vocalizations that Edwin found both fascinating and terrifying. He later learned that every step and movement carried specific meaning, and each dance had its own particular song. As warriors became fatigued, they would signal their withdrawal by bending forward, lowering their bodies toward the ground, and then stepping back from the circle. When all participants had retired in this manner, the dance concluded. The final step in Edwin's transformation into a tribal member involved a branding ceremony, permanently marking him as one of their own. From this point forward, he was addressed by his new name, Tatadare, meaning steep wind, likely a reference to how swiftly he had outpaced his pursuers during his escape attempt. With the ceremony complete, Edwin was granted a degree of freedom to move about the village, though always under watchful eyes. His newfound status offered protection, but not complete trust. In all my movements about the village, Edwin explained, I had but one purpose: to locate my wife. I searched every lodge and level I could access, but my efforts proved fruitless. Her whereabouts remained a mystery that consumed my thoughts despite my own remarkable change in circumstances. A brief reunion and separation one morning. Edwin joined the tribal members as they made their way to the temple for worship. Groups gathered at the doorways of various lodges before separating, some heading toward the river, where sparkling waters were just visible through the blue mist rising from the valley, others proceeding directly to the temple. Edwin ascended with the worshippers. Upon reaching the top, he found a number already assembled there. To his surprise, they made way for him, showing a deference that reflected his new status within the tribe. From this elevated position, Edwin had an excellent view of the village with its peculiar architecture. The structures below resembled truncated pyramids, varying from 1 to 4 stories in height. Each upper level was smaller than the one below, with the lower story serving as a terrace for the one above. The buildings were constructed of yellowish clay, with ladders leaning against each terrace to provide access to the higher levels. What strange structures met my view? Edwin later wrote no windows were visible, but doorways opened onto every terrace. The lodges of warriors and chiefs were distinguished by long poles projecting from their tops, displaying pennants with various tribal symbols. The temple where Edwin stood dominated the landscape, rising above all other structures. Near its base, Edwin noticed a corral containing cattle, and beside the central staff of the temple stood an altar with a burning fire. His attention was immediately drawn to a small group of female captives huddled nearby, their forms almost completely concealed by striped tribal blankets. Impelled by a force I couldn't resist, Edwin recalled, I moved toward them. One woman turned in my direction, and my heart stopped. It was my wife without hesitation. Edwin rushed forward, his sudden movement causing him to collide with several tribal members. His wife appeared initially frightened by the commotion, but upon recognizing his voice, she broke free from the group and ran into his arms. Their reunion proved heartbreakingly brief. The tribal members, recovering from their surprise, quickly separated the couple throughout the remainder of the ceremony. Mrs. Eastman was kept under guard and deliberately isolated from the man they now called Tatadare. A stir rippled through the crowd. As Walmetkla approached the altar, drums sounded and all present prostrated themselves in reverence. When the drums beat again, the introductory ceremony concluded, and the assembled worshippers stood motionless, facing east. The quartz wall enclosing the valley began to catch the morning light. Its needle-shaped pinnacles sparkled brilliantly, like diamonds reflecting the sun. A single ray penetrated into the valley, creating the illusion that the mountain itself had caught fire. In an instant, sunlight bathed the upturned faces of the worshippers and illuminated the surrounding landscape in radiant glory. Nature seemed to celebrate this moment. Birds sang their brightest songs, while the river sparkled and danced in the sunlight. The drums sounded once more, and the devotees prostrated themselves in submission before what they perceived as the arrival of their fiery deity, Quetzalcoatl. For Edwin, the spiritual moment held different significance. Having found his wife only to be separated from her again, he now faced new questions about their future. His adoption into the tribe had granted him unexpected protection, but would it provide a path to reunite with his wife? Or would his new identity as Tata dare forever keep them apart? What will happen next in Edwin and Mrs. Eastman's saga? Will his new tribal status offer opportunities for their reunion, or will it create insurmountable barriers to discover? How Edwin navigates his precarious position between two worlds and what fate awaits the Eastman couple. Subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories on YouTube. Each episode uncovers another chapter in this extraordinary historical account.